So I received the South Bend heavy-duty clutch for the 97 F250 with the ZF5. This is a 1944-50K-HD. It comes with the 2-stage pressure plate and the heavy-duty clutch, Kevlar pilot bearing. Anyway, this is the upgraded set for what I need, which is a little bit more horsepower and more towing weight. So, capacity, I should say. So I'm gonna open this up and we're gonna take a look at the two pieces, or the two sets, and talk about that just for a moment. So the kit is from PDR Diesel out of British Columbia, Canada. The kit sells for right about $1,000, but what you get is a 20,000 pound towing capacity, about 400, you want to use this on about an engine that's putting out about 425 horsepower. You're getting about 900 foot-pounds of torque with this clutch. And this is a 13-inch flywheel. So you can use a smaller clutch system on a 13-inch flywheel, 12.5, but I think, in my opinion, you lose if you do that. You want to spin this disc out as far as you can in order to get your centripetal force actually working really well. So we're gonna put this kit in, but also it comes with everything you need, really. It has the alignment tool, it has the throwout bearing, the pilot bearing is Kevlar, and it's a two-stage pressure plate system, clutch system. So the difference between the new one and the old one, you can see how much more filled in the new one is. Much higher mass than the more hollow older one. Of course, this has the old standard needle bearing for the pilot, and this has got the newer Kevlar. On the clutch service side, you can see that this has been milled down a lot sharper here, where this one is more beveled. It's the only real difference I see here. Obviously, we've got some burning on the old one, some overheating on that flywheel surface. So the trick here is just to manhandle the flywheel into place and get a couple of the top bolts started, and then you can use that by taking the jack down, letting it hang, and just find your guide pin that way. Then go ahead and put all the rest of the bolts in, push the plate into position, and then start to torque them down. These bolts per factory, I think it's about 89 foot-pounds of torque, but with a solid flywheel, you're supposed to go up to 95 based on my research. So I'm gonna torque these to 95. Make sure when you've got this thing torqued down before your pressure plate and clutch go in, that you have all this disc surface clean. You can use some kind of degreaser if you want to. I tend to go back over things with lacquer thinner just to get everything off. Anyway, that needs to be a totally clean surface, no fingerprints, no nothing. As you're torquing this down, of course, that flywheels are going to turn on you, so you need to figure out a way to stop the flywheel from turning. I'm using a pry bar, and I've nested the blade of the pry bar up in between the bottom of the transmission bell housing and the ring gear. So snug that up a little bit before you start cranking on it. Make sure it's nice and snug in there. Okay, the left is the old disc, the right is the new disc. Not a lot of wear, but I'm starting to think that they put a new clutch disc in and didn't mess with the pressure plate at all. When we look at these, that's the new one, of course. This is the pressure plate side. Critically important you put that on the pressure plate side, or you're not going to get this thing together right. This is the old one, of course, but I want you to look at something really interesting. The bearing surface for the throwout bearing should look like this one is brand new, right? Look at that. That is severely worn. That's why I think this pressure plate hasn't been replaced in a long time. Also, we're making sure that when we put this pressure plate on, that these fingers are flat like this whenever it is installed with the clutch disc. I just got off the phone with South Bend, and they said if these are not flat, you can put a crow's foot on them and bend them a little bit, but they will break if you're not careful. Mostly you have to bend them down so that the pilot bearing is fitting on top, throwout bearing is fitting on top of this is even all the way around. That's an important part of making sure that these are level like that when it's installed with the clutch plate. These should actually be popping up. So the reason I'm replacing this clutch isn't necessarily because of the clutch plate wear, but probably the pressure plate failing. I had almost no clutch on this thing, and that's probably the reason why right there. Anyway, that's the stage we're at now. I'm going to go ahead and fit the pressure plate and the clutch disc into place, and we'll take a look at these fingers at that point and see if they're flat. Okay, the alignment tool's in place, the clutch disc is in place, making certain that we don't see the sticker that says this side toward pressure plate. This is on correctly. Now we're going to slip the pressure plate over it and start the bolts. Okay, now we've got the alignment tool in place, the clutch disc is inside, the pressure plate's in place. I have torqued all of these bolts. I believe there's 8 bolts to 25 pounds. South Bend recommends 18 to 20, but my gosh, that just seems so loose to me. So I went to 25, which I found at the OEM specs. Make sure you can see that this says this side toward pressure plate. Don't get that backwards. And once you get it torqued down, all of these fingers should be laying flat. They shouldn't be, one of them shouldn't be sticking up higher or lower than the other. This is where the throwout bearing rides, so that's important to ride smoothly on all of them. That'll go on the shaft of the clutch yoke as it pushes these fingers to engage that clutch. Before I put the transmission on, I am going to go ahead and pull this starter off that's got the bad teeth. I may try to fix this at some point, save the starter and just put a new gear on if I can find a gear, because it's a good starter as a backup, but I'm going to go ahead and go buy a brand new one and slip it on so that I don't have this issue. You might notice there's a helicoil in there because this thing's stripped out, so be real careful with these bolts. 3-bolt system is the way to go. A lot of starters are sold with 2 bolts now. They go on a 3-bolt system and they do not fit well and they will wobble loose. Hence the helicoil, because I put a 2-bolt flanged high torque starter on this at one point, and it didn't last very long. $100 on eBay, it ain't worth it. Okay, throwout bearing time. This guy should just pull right off. It came off easier because I put it back on just to show you how it comes off. So I'm gonna emery cloth this before I put my new one on, and then when the new one's on, we're gonna lube these spines, lube here where the shaft goes into the pilot bearing, and I'm gonna also lubricate just in here with the fork. You see where it's rubbing? The fork rides, as well as this pivot point and this, where'd it go? This pivot point here. I'm gonna put grease on all of those things so that they slip and slide a little better. Okay, I have slid the transmission into position using a floor jack, centered right on that lug. That seems to be a balance point. And if you jack it up and try to get it aligned, this is really a booger to do, especially if you're just by yourself. But if you go straight up with it and then start sliding into position, if you can get a couple of the side bolts, or excuse me, a couple of top bolts started, or any of the bolts for that matter, and then just rock that thing back and forth until the splines line up. Make sure it's in neutral. And once you get it slipped into the spline, you can go ahead and put the rest of the bolts in, slowly and cautiously tighten those bolts, and it'll pull it onto the spline. If you get any binding whatsoever, don't force it. You're gonna have to back off and make sure your spline's lined up. There's no real good way to look up in there and see this, but that's just what you're gonna have to do. So now we're gonna put the crossmember back in so we can take the weight off of the transmission, and then we'll work on putting the transfer case on. Bye. So to get the transmission support bracket back on this piece, you're gonna have to jack the transmission up. That's why you want the bolts between the transmission and the ring gear to be fairly snug. You don't want them tight. You're not tightening them down and torquing them at this moment. You could, but I tend to do that after I get the transmission support piece in place and the transmission sitting on it right here. So to get this piece in, you're gonna have to weasel this thing back in. So I have one of these pieces here off, and the other one loose. So I fitted it at an angle, and then I pull it this way so that it's straight across, and that lines it up. And then everything's in place. You can go ahead and put your nuts and bolts back together. I put this one on first, make sure that those holes are lined up on both sides, and then I'm going to put this piece I never took off, I just left it in place. So I'm going to put the other one on and this point all loose, and then I'll tighten it all back up. And when that's all tightened, I'll set the transmission back down and tighten these two bolts, and then I'll torque up, I'll torque up the transmission to the bell housing, and then I'll tighten these two bolts. So the torque specifications for the 6 bolts that go around the transmission to the engine is 50. These at the top are extremely hard to get to and be able to use a torque wrench on that. So it's going to take quite a bit of manipulation. Way up in there, it's very hard to get to. The best you could do is maybe use universal joints, but you're not going to give you good torque readings. So the torque specifications for these nuts, which is the crossmember to the bottom of the transmission, is 60 to 81. So I'm going to go 75 on those. Okay, we're going to torque the transfer case to transmission. This is the nose cone, and it's 35 to 40, so I'm going to, or 30 to 40, so I'm going to go 35 pounds on those. Some of these, like the ones way down in here, you're probably not going to be able to get to at all with a torque wrench. If you can't do that, you're going to have to just guess at it, but 35 pounds on those. Okay, now you have to start putting these back together. So I had to mess with this lever and this lever enough to get these to line up. So now we'll snap that on, and we'll have the linkage between the shifter that's mounted to the transmission connected to the transfer case lever, and then that's done. And then we can start putting all the pieces back together that either connect systems or are plug and play, like the clutch assembly, hydraulic clutch. This piece can go on, this fits in here. All the wiring can go back into place, but we wanted to make sure we had the major systems installed, like the transmission and transfer case, before we start hooking things up, because if we have to take anything apart, we would have known by now. Okay, once we get all that hooked up, the drive shafts can go back on. Now on your drive shafts, you're going to want to make sure your universal joints are in good shape. Go ahead and have those replaced. If they're not, it's a good idea to do them anyway if there's any question whatsoever about their condition. Okay, we're finished with the install, but we're going to just go back over everything one more time before we put the guard back in place for the transfer case. Rear drive shaft attached. Of course, everything is torque to specs. Look up your torque specifications and make decisions based on what you find. The nose cone of the manual transmission is attached to the transfer case. I went ahead and replaced both front and rear drive shaft U-joints because they look pretty old. Moving forward, attach all your wiring in place so it's not in the way of the drive shaft. Here, it's clear the drive shaft well. Your linkages, make sure that's snapped in place for your 4x4 shifter linkage. Moving forward, front drive shaft in place. Moving around to the other side, slave cylinder in place, clip secured exactly on top and bottom as it should be. Remember, we lubricated all these moving joints on the fork, as well as anything else inside on the fork as we went and put that back together. The flywheel cover is in place. I have a new starter because my gear was eaten up. And then the only other thing is we had to go back and put the exhaust pipe back in place. And I actually have better clearance now than I did before. So that was a benefit. Otherwise, it would have been riding up against the transmission like it was. Other than that, I think that's it. I'm going to go to the top and rebuild the top of the transmission in another video if you want to watch that, but it was leaking. So it's a good idea to fix anything that's leaking. Anything else you find that's worn, replace that while you're here on this whole driveline part of the system. Nuts and bolts, check. The only thing you should have left over are your flywheel bolts and your pressure plate bolts. Everything else should be back on the vehicle.